Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador. Um, Every member on this panel will tell you that trade is critical to their home state, and I'm here to tell you that's true of Washington State. Apple growers export 1/3 of their crop each year. State Services exports over $26 billion a year, and the jobs in Washington supported by exports, over 90% depend on manufacturers selling their world-class products across the globe. But Washington's workers, farmers, and businesses cannot be left behind as other countries race to establish strong bilateral and regional agreements that carve us out. So while we work to update NAFTA, we must begin to put other negotiations in the pipeline. So I'm an old career law enforcement retired. I get the enforcement piece, but there's always community outreach. In my view, the TPP countries have been now left hanging. And frankly, I was disappointed, but encouraged that the President wants to go bilateral agreements. I'm on board with that and ready to go. As you know, we've had a chance to visit. But I think there has to be an aggressive, energetic outreach to these countries. And in my question is, beyond Canada and Mexico, which countries, regions, and/or sectors are priorities for the Trump administration? What's the next step after NAFTA?
Well, thank you, Congressman. We are still in the process of developing those priorities and that list. First, I would say that the President is very pro-trade. Secondly, that we, as you say, our objective is to have bilateral agreements and a series of them. And we think we can do that using model agreements and do it effectively and have agreements which are better for American workers and American apple growers and others. In terms of what specific countries we would go to, there are a lot that are on the table. Obviously, there's TTIP, which has been mentioned. There's a lot of people who believe that we have to go up to the TPP countries and start negotiating those. And of course, foremost among those, in some people's opinion, is Japan. So that's something we have to think about now.
But you're in communication with those TPP countries.
We are in communication. I've met with several of them, and there are a variety of issues in various places. And the Japanese, my guess is right now, are not ready to do a bilateral agreement with the United States. But these things are all developing. We're in discussions.
So after NAFTA, you're still considering TTIP, or Japan, or UK?
The UK is another option. So these are things, but I do think there's a lot of pressure to move into the direction where the TPP would have filled a gap and to go in there. And my instinct is that members of Congress also would feel comfortable if we started doing that. So I think there are a lot of reasons to militate in that direction. But the other thing is it does take two to tango, so we have to kind of develop this.
I want to be engaged with you on that. I'm sure other members of the committee do. How do you see the bilateral agreements coming together to create the high standards throughout the world? That's been touched on by a couple of members. And, just my personal experience with one country, Mr. Tiberi mentioned South Korea. In my discussions with assemblymen and women in South Korea and asking them the question, after the Korean agreement was finalized, what was their opinion as far as the impact it had on China? And their first response was China should start to pay attention because high standards now are in the region and will be developing. Of course, back then TPP was the thing that people were looking to. So that one agreement with Korea made an impact on that region. And so again, emphasizing the need to reach out to those countries, TPP countries, strengthening that position of strong standards. How do you see a bilateral agreement with Japan, for example, or others, strengthening that our standards throughout that region and the world?
Well, I would say, first of all, I don't want to suggest that we're going to have a bilateral agreement at this time with Japan. That's something that they're looking at and that we're looking at and all that sort of thing. But I certainly agree with the chairman's basic point at the very beginning, which you have also endorsed, which is that the United States moves in. We have an agreement that's a high standards agreement. In many cases, on a bilateral basis, you can have higher standards because that country that you're negotiating with may not have a particular problem in an area where you can get a high standard. A good example of that would be currency. If you're negotiating with someone who really isn't a currency manipulator, it's easier to get to a high standard on currency and then set the standard. So there are a lot of things that can be done like that. But I think having those kinds of agreements does push back against China, does change the standards, and does have people realize the United States is engaged in it, and it has a ripple effect throughout the region. So I completely endorse the point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.